Is there a link between exclusion and knife crime?
There is indeed a very strong link between exclusion and knife crime, and things to bear in mind first, I think, is the demographic of young people who get involved in knife crime. So young offenders more generally, and particularly those who get themselves involved in youth violence, are possibly the most vulnerable group of young people in our society. So they are very much more likely to be on child protection plans. They are often traumatised, very often have experienced neglect, abuse, and many of them, in my experience working with young offenders over the last few years, also have significant learning difficulties and often very significant speech and language difficulties. So they're a very vulnerable group, and it's also worth mentioning the data that the Ministry of Justice shared recently about young offenders. So 88% of young boys in young offender institutions have been excluded from school at some point, and 74% of girls, which is clearly a very strong correlation. And I think even more strikingly, 21% of young people who have a knife offence to their name have been permanently excluded from school. And that's compared with 0.1% of the general population. So that link is very, very strong. I suppose what's been disappointing for me and quite shocking reading the way that the Department for Education and Ofsted have evaluated this is they've tried to minimise it really. They've tried to minimise the link between these two things. So for example, people like Tom Bennett, who's the behaviour advisor to the government, and Amanda Spielman, who runs Ofsted, have tried to argue that because you can't show direct cause and effect, you can't show that there's a direct causal link between school exclusion and knife crime, that it's not really anything we should be considering in an enormous amount of depth, which is quite obviously wrong, because in social science it's very difficult to ever show cause and effect, and whilst school exclusion is very highly correlated with gang affiliation and poverty and school exclusion, you can't unpick it to the extent where you can show one thing causes another. But the fact remains there's a very, very strong correlation between the two.
So how do you explain the link between exclusion and knife crime?
So there are a number of reasons I think that exclusions and knife crime are very closely correlated. And it's probably worth explaining that using a couple of aspects of research, a couple of psychological constructs. So the first one I'd like to discuss is ostracization. So research is very powerful around the impact of being ostracized, and in experimental conditions, for example, when people are placed in two different groups and they don't know the people who were involved in this study previously, so they don't have any previous relationships with these people. If they're then ostracized and excluded from that group, contrived as it is, even that can cause quite significant negative feelings that can last over a period of time. So if you think of that in terms of schools and isolations and fixed-term exclusions, it really can be quite damaging and impactful on a young person to be ostracised even for a short period of time. And more strikingly, what the research tells us is that the same parts of the brain are active when ostracised as when experiencing physical pain. So that's quite interesting, and it tells us that it's basically like an injury. It's like another form of an injury, except it's a social one. And even more powerful than that, what's been found is that being ostracised actually lasts longer in terms of the pain caused. And it genuinely can leave quite deep injury on a person and their sense of self. So that's one reason. And the other aspect of research is around belongingness. So every single human being needs to feel connected. They need to feel a sense of belonging. They need to feel that they have consistent, nurturing, warm relationships with other human beings. And the reason that's important is very much embedded in the human psyche. So for evolutionary reasons, human beings have been drawn to groups, they've been drawn to connect for safety and security reasons over tens of thousands of years. So it's hardwired into us. So as you can imagine, being excluded from school, which is for some of these traumatised, vulnerable young people, the only place in the world that they might feel a sense of safety and security, is incredibly damaging. And as you might imagine, that can lead to really significant emotional injury for that young person. So I think those two things combined are extremely helpful in explaining the link between exclusions and knife crime.